I
Looks
was
good.
crouched on the floor of this little bookstore. My toolbox spread
Just a
open
little
next to
higher
me,
on the left,
a
maybe?
hammer in one hand, and a couple of screws pinched between my fingers. I was trying to wrestle a wobbly shelf back into shape. The kind of job that sounds simple, but always takes longer than you think. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, dusty bindings, and a faint hint of coffee from the machine. Mr. Jenkins, the owner, kept behind the counter. He'd been hovering nearby, muttering under his breath about how this shelf had been broken for weeks, maybe months, and how it was driving him up the wall. It was just another Saturday for me, one of those days where I bounce from one odd job to another, fixing things around town to keep the bills paid. Nothing glamorous, just steady work. I was focused, lining up a screw when the bell above the door gave its sharp little jingle, and she walked in. She looked right at me, her eyes catching mine with this easy, confident smile. And out of nowhere, she said, "You're better at this than my ex ever was." I froze mid-motion, not because of the compliment, but because of how she said it, like we'd been friends for years, like she'd been holding on to that line just for me. That moment, that one sentence flipped my whole day upside down. And honestly, my whole life took a turn I never could have predicted. I'm not the kind of guy who gets thrown off easily. I've been doing handman work for years now. Shelves, leaky faucets, creaky floors, you name it. People call me because I show up on time, get the job done right, and don't make a fuss. I'm not out here trying to charm anyone or spin some wild story about my life. I'm just Mike, the guy who fixes things and moves on to the next job. But that day in that cramped little bookstore, her words hit me like a rogue hammer. Maybe it was the way she said it with this quiet confidence. Or maybe it was how her eyes lingered on me just a second longer than they needed to. I didn't know her, had never seen her before in my life, but it felt like she knew something about me that I hadn't figured out yet. Like she saw past the toolbox and the sawdust to something deeper. Something I didn't even know was there. I looked up from the shelf, brushing a layer of sawdust off my jeans, and managed a half-mile. Thanks, I said, my voice coming out more like a question than I meant it to. I wasn't sure if she was serious or just messing with me, maybe trying to lighten the mood in this quiet shop. She was standing there holding a small stack of books, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail that looked like it was one tug away from falling apart. She had on this oversized sweater, the kind that makes you think of lazy Sunday mornings, cozy and unpretentious. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, but there was this energy about her, like she could walk into any room and make it her own without even trying. "No, really," she said, setting her books down on the counter with a soft thud. "My ex couldn't even hang a picture frame straight. You're out here saving shelves like it's your life's calling." She laughed then, and it wasn't one of those polite fake laughs people toss out to fill the silence. It was real warm, like she genuinely meant every word she was saying. I chuckled, shaking my head as I went back to tightening a screw, trying to keep my hands busy, so I didn't look as thrown off as I felt. "It's just a shelf," I said, "not exactly saving the world here." "Maybe not," she replied, leaning against the counter now, her elbow propped up casually as she watched me work. "But it's more than most people would bother with. You're good with your hands." That line made my face heat up, and I'm not the blushing type. Something about the way she said it, so offhand yet so intentional, got under my skin. I kept my eyes glued to the shelf, pretending to focus on the screw I was driving in, but my mind was racing a mile a minute. Who is this woman? Why was she talking to me like we'd known each other forever? And why did it feel like there was more to her words than just a casual compliment about my handman skills? It was like she was dropping hints, but I couldn't quite piece them together. Mr. Jenkins shuffled over then, completely oblivious to whatever was going on. He peered over his glasses, his voice gruff. "You almost done with that shelf, Mike?" He asked like he was half expecting me to have given up by now. "Yeah, just about," I said, giving the shelf a final tap with the hammer. It was solid now. No wobble, no creak, just the way it should be. I stood up, wiping my hands on a rag from my toolbox, and stole a glance at her. She was still there, flipping through one of her books, but I could tell she wasn't really reading. Her eyes kept darting back to me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for something. "It looks good," she said, nodding at the shelf like she was appraising a piece of art. You should put Shelf Whisperer on your business card. I laughed louder than I meant to, the sound bouncing off the quiet walls of the bookstore. I'll think about it, I said, starting to pack up my tools, trying to act like her comment hadn't just made my day. You come here often? Or you just go around complimenting random handmen? She grinned, closing the book she was holding with a soft snap. I come here when I need an escape, she said. And I don't usually compliment strangers, but you looked like you needed to hear it. That stopped me cold. Needed to hear it. What was that supposed to mean? I wanted to ask to dig into whatever she was getting at, but Mr. Jenkins was already handing her a receipt for her books, and I didn't want to make things awkward. I mean, I was just the guy fixing the shelf, right? Nothing special. But as she grabbed her bag and headed for the door, she turned back, her eyes catching mine again. I'm Claire, by the way, she said. Maybe I'll see you around, Mike, I said, nodding, trying to keep my voice steady. Yeah, maybe. And then she was gone, the bell jingling softly as the door swung shut behind her. I stood there for a second, staring at the empty doorway, feeling like I just let something slip through my fingers. Mr. Jenkins didn't seem to notice. He just handed me my payment, a crumpled wad of bills, and went back to sorting books on the counter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Claire's words that whole moment were going to stick with me for a long time. The rest of the day was a blur. I had a couple more jobs lined up. A squeaky door at a coffee shop that kept sticking. A drywall patch for some lady who'd accidentally put her fist through a wall during an argument. Normal stuff. The kind of thing I do without thinking. But my mind kept drifting back to the bookstore, to Claire's voice, to that line about her ex, and the way she'd looked at me like she saw something I didn't. By the time I got home that evening, I was replaying the whole thing in my head, trying to make sense of it. Was she just being friendly? Was she flirting? Or was there something else going on? Something I wasn't picking up on. I live in a small apartment. Nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom place with a couch, a TV, and a kitchen that's barely big enough to turn around in. I dropped my toolbox by the door, the metal clanging against the floor, and grabbed a beer from the fridge. I sank onto the couch, the springs creaking under me, and just sat there staring at the bottle in my hand, still thinking about Claire. I don't usually get hung up on people like this. I'm not a loner, not exactly, but I keep to myself. I've had relationships before, a couple of girlfriends over the years, but nothing serious, nothing that lasted. Most of the time, I'm too busy working, moving from one job to the next to think about anything else. But that night, I couldn't stop wondering about her. What was her story? Why had she said that thing about her ex? And why did it feel like she was trying to tell me something without coming right out and saying it? The next day, I found myself back at the bookstore. Not because I had another job there, but because I couldn't stay away. I told myself I was just checking on the shelf, making sure it was holding up under the weight of all those books, but deep down I knew the truth. I was hoping to see her again. Mr. Jenkins looked surprised when I walked in, his bushy eyebrows shooting up. Back already, he said, peering at me over the counter. Shelf giving you trouble? Nah, I said, trying to sound casual, like I just happened to be in the neighborhood, just in the area. Thought I'd make sure it's still standing. He shrugged, clearly not buying it, but not caring enough to press the issue, and went back to his work. I wandered over to the shelf, running my hand along the edge, checking for any give. It was fine, of course. I'd done a good job like always, but as I stood there pretending to inspect my work, I heard the bell jingle again. My heart did this weird little jump, and I turned around half expecting it to be her. It wasn't just some guy in a trench coat asking Mr. Jenkins for a mystery novel. I felt a pang of disappointment, which was ridiculous. I didn't even know her. She was just some woman who'd said something nice, maybe flirted a little. Why was I acting like a kid with a crush? I shook it off, grabbed a random book off the shelf, and pretended to browse, but I wasn't reading a word. I was just killing time hoping. A few days later, it happened again. I was back at the bookstore again. No job, just browsing, because apparently I turned into the kind of guy who hangs out in bookstores, hoping to run into a stranger. I was flipping through a book on woodworking, not because I needed it, but because it gave me something to do with my hands when I heard her voice. Back to check on your masterpiece. I turned around and there she was standing by the counter with that same easy smile that made my stomach flip. I tried to play it cool, holding up the book like it was proof I had a reason to be there. Something like that, I said, just doing some research. She walked over, her boots clicking softly on the hardwood floor, and glanced at the book in my hands. Woodworking, huh? So you're not just a shelf fixer. You've got layers. I laughed, setting the book down on a nearby table. Not really, just like to keep busy. She tilted her head, studying me like I was one of the books on the shelf. You're humble, she said. I like that. There it was again. That feeling like she was seeing something in me. I didn't even see myself. We started talking. Just small stuff at first. Books we liked. The quirks of this little town. The way the weather couldn't seem to make up its mind. But it didn't feel like small talk. It felt like we were picking up a conversation we'd started years ago. Like we already knew each other's rhythm. She told me she worked at a local art gallery curating exhibits, which made sense with the creative energy she gave off. I told her about my handman gigs, how I'd ended up in this town after moving around a bit, looking for a place that felt like home. You ever think about doing more with it? She asked, gesturing to my hands, which were still smudged with a bit of sawdust from an earlier job. Like building furniture or something. You've got the skills. I shrugged, stuffing my hands in my pockets. Never really thought about it. I just fix what's broken. She smiled, and it was one of those smiles that felt like it held a secret. Maybe you should, she said. You're good at fixing things, Mike, not just shelves. That comment hit me harder than it should have. It wasn't just about my work. It felt like she was talking about something bigger, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and we kept talking. Before I knew it, an hour had passed and Mr. Jenkins was giving us the sigh. Probably wondering why we were taking up space in his store without buying anything. Claire glanced at her watch inside. I've got to get back to the gallery, she said. But this was nice. Yeah, I said, wishing I could come up with something better. Something that would keep her there a little longer. It was... She hesitated for a second, then pulled a pen out of her bag and scribbled something on a scrap of paper. Here, she said, handing it to me. In case you ever need an art gallery to visit or, someone to talk to. I looked at the paper. It was her number written in neat looping handwriting. My heart did that stupid jump again, but I just nodded and said, thanks. I'll keep that in mind. She smiled and headed for the door, the bell jingling as she left. I stood there holding the scrap of paper, feeling like I'd just been handed something important. Something I didn't quite know what to do with. I didn't call her right away. I wanted to, but I didn't want to seem desperate. And honestly, I wasn't even sure what I'd say. Hey, it's the shelf guy. But I kept that paper in my wallet, and every time I opened it to grab some cash, I'd see her handwriting and think about calling. A week later, I was working on a job at the community center, prying up some loose floorboards that had been tripping people up during yoga classes. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I figured it was another client with another job. But when I checked it, it was a text from an unknown number. Hey, shelf guy, you free this weekend? The gallery's got a new exhibit and I could use a handman's perspective. I stared at the text, a grin spreading across my face before I could stop it. It was her. I texted back trying to keep it cool. Maybe. What's the exhibit? She replied almost instantly. Abstract sculptures, very hands-on. You'd like it. I laughed, shaking my head as I typed back. She was good at this, pulling me in without making it obvious. We texted back and forth for a bit, and by the end of it, I'd agreed to stop by the gallery on Saturday. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but I was curious not just about the art, but about her, about what made her tick. Saturday came and I showed up at the gallery, feeling a little out of place in my jeans and flannel. Everyone else was dressed like they were attending some fancy event, all tailored jackets and shiny shoes. But Claire spotted me right away and waved me over like I was the only person in the room who mattered. She was wearing this bright red dress that stood out against the stark white walls of the gallery. And she looked so confident, so completely at ease in her world. Thanks for coming, she said, handing me a glass of wine, her fingers brushing mine for just a second. I wasn't sure you'd show. I wasn't sure either, I admitted, taking the glass and hoping I didn't look as out of place as I felt. Not really my scene. She laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. You'll survive. Come on, I'll give you the tour. She led me around the gallery, pointing out sculptures made of everything from glass to rusted metal, explaining what they meant, or at least what the artists thought they meant. I didn't get most of it. Abstract art isn't exactly my thing, but I liked listening to her talk. She had this way of making everything sound interesting, like every piece had a story behind it, a reason for existing. I asked her questions partly to keep her talking, but also because I was starting to see things differently through her eyes, like the world had more layers than I'd ever noticed. We stopped in front of this massive sculpture, a chaotic tangle of twisted metal and weathered wood. To me, it looked like something you'd find in a junkyard, but Claire was staring at it like it held the answers to life's big questions. "What do you see?" she asked, glancing at me. I shrugged, taking a sip of my wine to buy some time. "It looks like someone threw a bunch of junk together and called it art." She laughed, not in a condescending way, but like she genuinely loved my honesty. "Fair enough," she said. "But look closer. It's about struggle, about taking broken things and making them whole again. Kind of like what you do." There it was again. That thing she did, tying everything back to me in a way that made me feel seen. Really seen for the first time in a long time. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, hoping she didn't notice how much her words were getting to me. We kept walking, kept talking, and the conversation shifted from art to life. She told me about growing up in a small town like this one. How she'd always loved art but never thought she'd make a career out of it. How she'd fought to carve out a place for herself in a world that didn't always take her seriously. I told her about my dad who'd been a carpenter, how he taught me everything I know about building and fixing. How I'd lost him a few years back and sometimes felt like I was still trying to live up to his example. It was easy talking to her, easier than it had ever been with anyone else. By the time the gallery started to clear out, I realized I didn't want the night to end. I walked her to her car, the air cool and quiet around us, the street lights casting long shadows on the pavement. "Thanks for inviting me," I said, shoving my hands in my pockets to keep from fidgeting. "This was different." "Different good or different bad?" she asked, raising an eyebrow, that teasing smile back on her face. "Different. Good," I said, smiling back. "Really good." She smiled, and for a second I thought about kissing her. The thought hit me hard, but I held back. Not sure if she wanted that. Not sure if I was reading the moment right. Instead, I said, "You want to grab coffee sometime? I mean, if you're not too busy saving the art world." She laughed, the sound bright in the quiet night. "I think I can make time for coffee," she said. "Text me." And that's how it started. Coffee turned into dinners. Dinners turned into long walks around town talking about everything and nothing. Before I knew it, Claire was a part of my life in a way I hadn't expected. In a way I hadn't even known I wanted. She was different from anyone I'd ever met. Not just because she was smart and funny and beautiful, but because she saw me. Not just the handman. Not just the guy who fixes broken things, but me. The guy underneath all that. And for the first time in a long time, I started to see myself differently, too. Like maybe I was more than just the sum of my tools and my jobs. We've been together for a few months now, and I still think about that day in the bookstore when she walked in and said those words that changed everything. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been fixing that shelf. If she hadn't said what she said. Maybe we would have crossed paths some other way. Or maybe we wouldn't have. But I'm glad she did, because it wasn't just about a shelf or a compliment or even her ex. It was about her seeing something in me that I hadn't seen in myself and showing me that sometimes the smallest moments can fix things you didn't even know were broken. It's funny how life works sometimes. You go through your days doing the same things, fixing the same kinds of problems, and you think that's all there is. But then someone walks in, says something you didn't expect, and suddenly the world feels bigger, fuller, like there's more to it than you ever realized. Claire did that for me. She didn't just walk into the bookstore that day. She walked into my life. And I'm still trying to figure out how I got so lucky. Every time I pass that bookstore, I think about that shelf, that moment, and I smile because it's a reminder that sometimes the things you fix end up fixing you right back.